I never thought that such a simple decision could change the course of my life forever. That morning, the sky was clear, and the sun shone over Ra-Eva, our little island lost in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It was a day like any other, but the boredom was almost unbearable. Mana was only 15 years old, and I already felt like I needed something beyond that monotonous routine. We were all tired of school, the same landscapes and the peaceful life of an island with just over 200 inhabitants. There wasn't much to do there other than study, and that didn't excite us at all. It was then that, in a casual conversation, one of my friends asked if I had ever thought about visiting Fiji, that island that in our minds seemed like a true paradise. The idea stayed in my head, burning like a flame. Of course I wanted to visit Fiji. The problem was that no one there seemed willing to take us. Our parents were too busy with their chores, and we, restless young people, wanted more. Then, a plan began to form. I invited 5 other friends to embark on this adventure with me. We would sail to Fiji ourselves. The idea was completely crazy. None of us had any real sailing experience. The closest we came to this was watching the local fishermen come and go, but that didn't put us off. We wanted to live this adventure, prove that we were capable of something great. It didn't take long for everyone to agree, and then we started preparing, or rather, what we called preparing at the time. Our resources were ridiculously scarce. We managed to add 2 bunches of bananas, some coconuts, and a small gas stove. We had no maps, no compasses, not even blankets. But the excitement was so much that these details seemed insignificant to us. The adrenaline of embarking on this journey blinded us to the dangers that lay ahead. The last hurdle before we left was getting a boat. None of us had one, and obviously, no one would lend us one for such a dangerous crossing. So we made a drastic decision. We would steal one of the fishermen's boats. In our youthful minds, this seemed like a good idea, almost like it was part of the adventure. So on a calm morning, with a clear horizon and a light breeze in the air, we sneaked down to the beach and take a small fishing boat. It was a simple boat, with a sail and rudder. Nothing that really matched what we wanted to face. But it was what we had. We climbed aboard, 6 boys, our eyes full of expectation and our hearts pounding with excitement. The ocean looked inviting at that moment. The first hours of the trip were filled with laughter and conversations about what we would do when we arrived in Fiji. We were excited about the possibility of exploring a new island, a real city, with people, lights, and sounds we had never experienced before. But reality began to knock softly on our door when, after hours of browsing, boredom began to set in. The ocean stretched endlessly in front of us. Just water everywhere. At first we tried to keep our spirits up, but the truth was that none of us knew exactly where we were going. The sun set, and night fell. The boat rocked gently, and little by little we all fell asleep. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's exactly what happened. We shouldn't have slept, of course, but tiredness and the lack of any sign of immediate danger made us relax. We were completely at the mercy of the ocean. When I woke up, everything had changed. The boat was shaking violently. A storm had appeared out of nowhere with howling winds and high waves, as if the sea had decided to swallow us all at once. Panic took over everyone. The sail was torn off by the force of the wind, and in a matter of seconds we lost control over the boat. We tried desperately to maneuver him, but it was useless. The rudder broke soon after, leaving us adrift like a leaf caught in a storm. The waves tossed us from side to side, and I clung to what I could, trying to stay on the boat. My friends screamed, fear written all over their faces. We didn't know what to do. For a moment I thought that would be the end, that we would die there, in the middle of the ocean without anyone knowing what had happened to us. But as if by a miracle, the storm passed as quickly as it had begun. When the sea finally calmed down, we were completely lost. No sail, no rudder, and no idea where we were. There was no land in sight, only the vast ocean surrounded us. The silence that followed the storm was almost deafening. Adrift, and what had once seemed like an exciting adventure was now turning into a nightmare. After the storm were pure disbelief. How could we have been so foolish? I looked at my friends' faces, and saw the same expression that was probably on mine. Fear. Fear of dying there, in that immensity of water with no one to rescue us. And worst of all, we had no idea how long we would survive with the few provisions we brought. The sun shone again, but it did not bring comfort. The headquarters began to set up quickly. We tried drinking the seawater, but soon realized that this only made the situation worse. We decided to ration what little we had. We divided the rainwater we had managed to collect into small sips, one in the morning and one in the late afternoon. It was all we had. The days dragged on, and hunger also began to eat away at us. 8 days passed in this silent torture. The boat drifted. We didn't know where we were going, without enough food and practically without water. We tried fishing, but were unsuccessful. Desperation was beginning to take over us. I asked myself all the time how we let the situation get to this point. We had been so naive, so impulsive. It was then, on the 8th day, when hope seemed to be fading, that something incredible happened. As I looked at the horizon, trying to find any sign of land, I saw what appeared to be a mirage. A dark, almost indistinct shape began to materialize in the distance. I blinked several times, thinking it was a figment of my imagination. But then I realized it was an island. When I realized that it was actually an island, my mind gave a leap of hope. For a moment, I felt a joy I hadn't felt in days. I tried to contain my enthusiasm so as not to seem insane, but soon we all saw what seemed to be salvation. We didn't know where we were. We had no idea if that island was inhabited or even if we would be able to survive there. But one thing was certain. The feeling of despair that had accompanied us for days began to dissipate, and in its place, hope was reborn. The drifting boat, no matter how uncontrollable it was, seemed to be being carried by the currents towards that island. Slowly, we began to approach the rocks that rose on the horizon. There was a problem, however. The boat was without a rudder, and the currents did not guarantee that we would reach the beach exactly. The risk of being dragged to the reefs or even to another side of the island was real. We needed to do something, and quickly. I made a decision that at the time seemed like the only option. We had no control over the boat, but I could try to swim to shore. Even with my body weak from the lack of food and water, I decided to take a risk. I jumped into the cold water and started swimming with all the energy I had left. My arms felt like they weighed a ton, and each stroke was a monumental effort. The sea pulled me back, but I refused to give up. I arrived at the beach feeling like my body was on the verge of collapse. My heart was pounding, and the solid ground beneath my feet felt unstable. It felt like the ground was shaking, but in reality, my body was too weak to stand. I fell to my knees in the sand and looked around. The island was bigger than I imagined. Huge, steep rocks rose in several directions, and dense vegetation took over the interior. It seemed like an inhospitable, wild place. But it also carried a beauty that I couldn't ignore, even in that state of despair. I took a deep breath, trying to regain my strength. I got up with difficulty and signaled to my friends who were still on the boat. There was no sign of human life, and nothing indicated that the island would be safe. But at that moment, we had no choice. We needed to leave the boat and come to dry land. One by one, my friends followed my lead, jumping out of the boat and swimming to shore. When everyone finally arrived, we collapsed onto the sand, exhausted. For a few hours, we simply lay there, trying to catch our breath and absorb what had just happened. We had survived adrift for 8 days in the ocean, and now we were on an unknown island, isolated from everything and everyone. What we would do next was the question that hung over us all. We were so tired and hungry that the only thing we could do at that first moment was sleep. The next morning, the sun rose over the horizon, bringing with it the need for action. I knew that if we didn't organize ourselves quickly, our stay on that island could be the end of us all. Our first priority was to find water. Without it, we wouldn't last long. The fruit we had brought from the boat was practically gone, and we only had a few coconuts left. Without fresh water, we were doomed. We walked along the beach looking for any sign of water, and after a few hours we found something that seemed like a gift from heaven. A fallen log, with water accumulated in its cavity. It was rainwater, clean enough for us to drink. We don't think twice. We drank greedily, quenching the thirst that had tormented us for days. It was as if life returned to our bodies at that moment. With our thirst temporarily resolved, we decided to explore the island more calmly. We knew that to survive, we would need more than just a log of water. And it was during this exploration that we had another stroke of luck. As we walked through the vegetation, one of the boys, Kolo, found something that looked like it had been left by the island's ancient inhabitants. It was a rustic knife, rusty with age, but still sharp enough to be useful. That knife would become our main tool in the following weeks, being used for everything from cutting fruit to defending ourselves from possible danger. As we made our way across the island, we climbed to the highest point we could find, hoping to get a clearer view of where we were. From up there, we saw that the island was relatively large, with several areas that looked promising for exploration. There were many coconut trees, some fruit trees, and fauna that included seabirds and small animals. Although we were in a precarious situation, this discovery renewed our determination. But we couldn't afford to get comfortable just yet. We were weak, malnourished, and without adequate shelter. We needed to act quickly. We decided that our next step would be to build a shelter, something that could protect us from the elements and allow us to rest properly. However, none of us had the strength to carry out this task immediately. Our bodies were still weakened by the lack of nutrients. So the first thing we did was try to recover our energy with the little food we had. In the days that followed, we explored the island further and began collecting everything we could to ensure our survival. We found some fruits like papaya, coconuts, and some edible roots. This helped us gain a little more strength, enough to start working on a makeshift shelter. We used coconut leaves to build a kind of hut. It wasn't anything luxurious, but it was big enough for the 6 of us and would protect us from the wind and rain that would eventually come. Meanwhile, our concern about the lack of water continued to grow. The log we found wouldn't be enough to keep us hydrated for long. We needed to find a more reliable water source. We decided that we would continue to explore the interior of the island in search of a stream, well, or any other source of fresh water. The truth is that despite all our initial achievements, reality was still bleak. We were stranded on an unknown island, not knowing if we would ever be rescued. At night, when silence took over, it was easy to feel the weight of our situation. We looked up at the starry sky and wondered if someone somewhere knew we were alive. Our biggest challenge, besides physical survival, was maintaining hope. The island that had become our new home was wild and full of mysteries. In the early days, as we explored the environment, the reality of our situation became clearer. We were alone, with no sign that we would be rescued soon. The provisions we brought on the boat had already run out, and the island, although apparently rich in natural resources, still offered us immense challenges. The first priority was to stay hydrated, and we soon realized that the water accumulated in the fallen log would be insufficient to sustain us in the long term. We needed to find a more lasting solution. The situation forced us to explore every corner of the island. We walked for hours, climbing hills and passing through dense forests in search of a source of water. Thirst began to get worse, and with each passing day, the urgency to find water increased. We knew that without it, our survival would be compromised in a matter of days. During one of these explorations, while following the dry bed of an old stream, we found a small depression in the ground where rainwater had collected. It was little, but enough to give us temporary hope. But the fight for water was just one of our challenges. Hunger was another constant enemy. Our bodies were beginning to weaken, and the amount of food available on the island was limited. We discovered some fruits like papaya and coconut that helped us in the first few days, but we knew that wouldn't be enough in the long term. The surrounding environment was inhospitable, and other than a few seabirds, there were no signs of large animals that could serve as game. It was a difficult situation, and every day our energy drained a little more. It was then that we started to organize ourselves. We needed a clear routine, divided responsibilities to ensure no one succumbed to tiredness or hopelessness. We decided that 2 of us would be responsible for finding food and water, while the others would work on building a safer shelter. We couldn't continue sleeping out in the open, at the mercy of the weather conditions. With the few tools we had, including the old rusty knife we found, We began cutting coconut leaves and tying branches together to build a shelter. It wasn't a house, but a rudimentary hut that protected us from the wind and rain, enough so that we could get a good night's rest. The survival routine began to take shape. Each morning we met to discuss what needed to be done. There was a mixture of determination and tiredness in everyone's eyes. We knew we couldn't weaken, but at the same time, we felt the weight of our situation. We were isolated, without contact with the outside world, and no one knew what had happened to us. Although we were hopeful that our families were looking for us, the truth is that we didn't know how long it could take. Days, months, or maybe we would never be found. Meanwhile, our need for food led us to try new strategies. We decided to use the makeshift spears we had made to fish in the shallow waters around the island. The sea seemed to be a source of resources that we had not yet fully explored, and we soon realized that there were fish in the areas close to the coast. At first, fishing was a challenge. We had no experience, and many of us had never fished before. But hunger gave us extra strength to learn quickly. After several failed attempts, we managed to catch some small fish. That was an immense relief. Cooked over the fire we finally managed to light, the fish gave us a new wave of energy. As the weeks went by, our bodies began to adapt to the routine. Even with the limited diet, the fact that we were able to organize ourselves and find sources of food and water, even though they were scarce, gave us a feeling of control. Things were still difficult, but at least we were no longer completely adrift, neither physically nor emotionally. Fire, in particular, was a great achievement. Being able to make a fire with friction was a moment of celebration for all of us. That heat emanating from the flames not only warmed us on cold nights but also brought a feeling of security and comfort. However, life on the island was still full of uncertainty and danger. One of the biggest problems we faced was the lack of drinking water. As much as we could find puddles of rainwater or small natural deposits, it was never enough. Every time we drank, we knew it could end the next day, and we had no way of predicting when the next rain would come. This forced us to make difficult decisions such as rationing water to minimum levels. We shared small amounts between us, drinking only what we needed to stay hydrated. It was a life of scarcity and sacrifice, but also of resilience. Additionally, we started trying to capture seabirds. The seagulls that flew over the island and nested on the nearby cliffs became a viable target to supplement our diet. We climbed to the highest cliffs and with extreme care, captured the birds without them noticing. It was dangerous work, especially for our weakened bodies, but it was worth it. Birds provided meat and, in some situations, even their blood served as a source of hydration when fresh water was scarce. It may seem primitive, but survival required drastic measures. Over time, we got used to life on the island. Even though our bodies were marked by weight loss and fatigue, our minds remained focused. We organized our time between searching for food, maintaining shelter, and constantly watching the horizon, hoping to spot a ship that could rescue us. We created a kind of smoke signal which we kept lit during the day, in an attempt to attract the attention of any vessel that passed nearby. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and no sign of rescue appeared. As time passed, something curious happened. We began to get used to our situation. The island, which initially seemed like a place of danger and isolation, began to become our home. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't safe, but we were alive. And that was the most important thing. We start creating little routines to maintain our sanity. Kolo, the most creative among us, even improvised a rudimentary guitar with pieces of wood and steel wires we found on the boat. Music helped pass the time and brought a little joy to an environment that often felt hostile. But despite all our achievements, we knew that it couldn't last forever. The island was a temporary place, and our true hope still lay in the fact that, at some point, someone would find us. The days on the island passed slowly. With each sunrise, a new challenge presented itself, and even though we had already established a survival routine, uncertainty about the future weighed on our minds. As time passed, isolation began to take its toll. Nature, which at first seemed hostile, had become familiar, but this did not lessen the feeling of being completely alone in the world. Routine, although essential for our survival, also made things monotonous. Every morning we woke up and divided ourselves between tasks: fishing, looking for fruit, keeping the fire going, fetching rainwater or any other source we could find. But the physical effort, day after day, began to exhaust us. It wasn't just hunger that weakened us, but emotional and mental exhaustion. The silence that hung over the island was oppressive. On the darkest nights, when the wind blew through the trees and the sea roared against the cliffs, fear settled in our hearts. What if we were never rescued? What if we were doomed to spend the rest of our lives on that isolated piece of land, far from our families, friends, and any kind of civilization? These thoughts haunted each of us, even if we tried to ignore them. Keeping my head up was a constant challenge. Kolo, always the most optimistic among us, did his best to keep morale high. His improvised guitar, made from pieces of wood and steel wire, had become a symbol of resistance. Nights around the campfire, with him playing simple, out-of-tune chords, became precious moments. Sometimes we sang together. Sometimes we just remained silent, letting the melody transport us far away, to a time when things were simpler. But it wasn't always easy to maintain harmony in the group. Living in an extreme situation like that, without any type of privacy or escape, began to generate friction. Small arguments arose for trivial reasons: the division of food, the pace of tasks, or even the way someone looked at the other. The accumulated stress turned us into time bombs, ready to explode at the slightest sign of provocation. There was a night when the tension reached its peak. We were all around the campfire, tired and irritable after a particularly difficult day. We hadn't managed to catch anything. The amount of fruit on the island seemed to be dwindling, and hunger was more intense than ever. Stephen, one of the youngest, suggested that we should ration the food even more to make sure it lasts. This, however, was the trigger for a fight. Mono, who always saw himself as the leader of the group, vehemently disagreed. The argument between the two soon involved everyone else. For a few minutes, we completely forgot about our situation, and screams filled the beach. Accusations, harsh words, and repressed resentments came to the surface. It seemed like, at that moment, everything was about to fall apart. It was Kolo who intervened, bringing us back to reality with a simple sentence but full of truth. If we keep fighting like this, there will be no one left to be rescued. Those words echoed in the silence that followed. He was right. We were destroying ourselves from within, and that would only make our survival even more difficult. It was a moment of reflection for all of us. Anger and frustration gave way to shame. We realized that if we didn't stick together, the island, which was already ruthless, would defeat us effortlessly. From that day on, we made a silent pact that we would need to work together, above all else. Despite this, the emotional exhaustion did not disappear. Missing home was a constant feeling. We each dealt with it in different ways. Sometimes we talked about our families, trying to remember the good times and imagine what they were doing at that exact moment. At other times, the silence was absolute, as if no one wanted to bring up the subject, fearing that the mere mention of our loved ones would make the pain of distance even more difficult to bear. The most melancholy moments, however, came during the night watch. We had established shifts so that there was always someone awake, watching the horizon for any sign of a ship or aircraft that might pass by. During these solitary vigils, the immensity of the sea in front of us seemed to increase the feeling of isolation. It was difficult not to feel insignificant in the face of the vastness of that ocean, where our existence seemed to be just a small dot lost on the map. I remember one night in particular. The sky was clear, and the stars were shining brightly. The sound of waves crashing on the rocks in the distance was mesmerizing, and for a moment I almost allowed myself to forget everything. That's when, in the distance, I saw a faint glow on the horizon. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be a boat? A rescue signal? I ran to wake the others, and in a matter of minutes we were all on the beach looking in the same direction. The glow seemed stronger now, and for an instant, hope shone in our hearts. We lit the fire and started shouting, hoping that someone somewhere would hear us. But as time passed, we realized the harsh reality. The glow was just moonlight reflecting off distant waves. There was no boat. There was no rescue. That moment was devastating. False hope had brought us down, and the frustration that followed was immense. For the first time, some of us began to seriously doubt that we would be found. The reality that we could be trapped there for much longer than we imagined began to settle in our minds. Over time, we realized we needed to prepare for long-term survival. We started thinking more strategically. We built a more resistant shelter, using branches and palm leaves to better protect us from the elements. We tried to make small plantations with the seeds of the fruits we found, hoping that they could provide us with food in the future, and most importantly, we continue to look for ways to increase our self-sufficiency. Ata Island had become our home, but we knew that without rescue, it could also become our grave. With each passing day, the line between hope and despair became thinner. What challenged us most on the island of Ata, besides the isolation and hunger, was the time that passed without any sign of rescue. The idea that perhaps no one knew where we were and that we might be forgotten was terrifying. But as much as this fear haunted us, we knew that if we let hope die, our fate would be sealed. We needed to keep fighting. The food problem was constant. Although we found some sources of food, such as fruits and fish, this was not enough to keep our bodies strong and healthy. The hunting and gathering process was increasingly challenging. The fruit on the trees was not as abundant as we had hoped, and we soon realized that if we didn't diversify our food sources, we were taking a big risk. So we decided to focus on seabirds. The gulls that flew over the island, nesting in the rocky cliffs, seemed to be a good source of meat. They were plentiful, and if we could capture them efficiently, we could secure at least a few meals a week. But catching seagulls was not an easy task. They were fast and their nests were positioned in difficult-to-access places, requiring courage and precision. One afternoon, as we were walking along the beach, Stephen suggested that we go up to the cliffs and try to catch a seagull. We knew it would be risky, but at that time, risks were part of our routine. We put a makeshift knife on our waist and climbed together to the top of the cliff. The wind there was strong, and the sound of the waves hitting the rocks below reminded us how any mistake could be fatal. The seagulls, alert, began to flutter as we approached. We decided that I would be the first to try. I moved slowly, low, trying not to scare them, while the others watched me. I got close enough to one of the nests, and with a quick movement, I managed to grab a seagull before it took flight. The bird struggled, letting out shrill cries as I struggled to keep it steady. My heart was beating hard in my chest, but the survival instinct spoke louder. With the knife, I did what needed to be done. It was a strange moment. Capturing and killing that bird, despite being necessary, brought me a feeling of discomfort. There was a fine line between our humanity and the brutality that survival required. But at that moment, hunger surpassed any philosophical reflection on life and death. We needed to eat. I carried the seagull back to our camp where we lit a fire and began preparing it for our meal. The smell of roasting meat was a relief to our senses after weeks of eating only raw fruit and fish. As simple as it was, that meal gave us a feeling of victory, that we were, little by little, conquering our survival on that wild island. We took turns hunting, and within a few days, capturing seagulls became a dangerous but efficient routine. However, no matter how much we managed to hunt, the issue of water continued to be our biggest problem. Rain was our only reliable source, and even that was scarce. We tried to store as much as possible when it rained, using coconut leaves as containers, but this water didn't last long, and we had no way of predicting when the next storm would hit. Sometimes the sky filled with clouds, and we waited for a storm that never came. During these days, our frustration grew to unbearable levels. It was then that Stephen, always an explorer and curious, decided to venture alone to a new part of the island. He was determined to find something that could help us solve this dilemma. For days, he would disappear for hours, always returning with bad news. Until one day, while walking towards the ancient volcanic crater in the center of the island, Stephen made a discovery that would change our luck. Upon arriving at the crater, he noticed something that had previously gone unnoticed by us. On one of the slopes, hidden among the rocks and dense vegetation, there was a small crevice that led to a kind of underground cave. Inside, moisture on the walls indicated there might be a source of water. He ran back to camp to tell us. When I heard that, a new hope was born in me. and we soon organized an expedition to the place. Arriving at the cave, we were all surprised by what we found. At the bottom of the cave, there was a small spring of water, slowly dripping from the rocks. It wasn't a brook or an abundant spring, but it was enough to save us. We immediately started collecting that precious water. Although it was small, it was clean and fresh and could keep us hydrated for the next few days. It was as if the island was testing us, forcing us to fight for every drop of life it could offer. With the water from the cave and the meat from the seagulls, our chances of survival have improved significantly. We were no longer hostage to luck to find food and water. There was a sense of relief in the air, but we also knew we couldn't settle. The next challenge was always lurking. During this period, our physical health began to stabilize. We were still thin and weak, but not as desperate as we had been in the first few weeks. We even managed to capture some wild chickens that had been left on the island by former inhabitants. These now wild chickens became a valuable source of protein, and the eggs we found gave us essential nutrients. However, the island, despite providing us with basic resources, was still an unforgiving place. And as if to remind us of that, she presented us with yet another obstacle. On a seemingly peaceful afternoon, Stephen decided to go alone to the cliffs to catch more seagulls. But this time, something went wrong. As he approached a nest, he slipped on a wet rock and fell. There was a 12-meter drop to the ground. When we heard his scream, we ran there, but it was too late. We found Stephen lying down, with a broken leg and several bruises on his body. He was groaning in pain, unable to move. The sight was devastating. We didn't have enough medical knowledge to deal with such a serious situation. We knew that if he had been alone, this fall could have been a death sentence. But we were a group, and that made all the difference. Very carefully, we carried Stephen back to camp. We used twigs and leaves to improvise a kind of stretcher, and slowly placed him in the shelter. We had no way to fix his leg bone, but we did the best we could to stabilize him and keep him comfortable. We knew his recovery would be long, and that meant the rest of us would have to work double time to make sure everyone had food and water. In the months that followed, we cared for Stephen as best we could. He remained motionless for a long time, and it deeply shook his spirit. But somehow he kept fighting, even though his situation was desperate. The time he spent lying down frustrated him, but we knew it was only a matter of time before he started to improve, albeit slowly. The island tested us constantly, but we survived one day at a time. Stephen's fall was a devastating blow to us all. Her scream still echoed in my mind days after the accident. Even as he lay still, his legs swollen and immobile, the fear of losing him was constant. The weight of our responsibility increased every day. There were 6 of us when we arrived on the island, but now one of us was unable to help. This meant that the other 5 would need to redouble their efforts to ensure our survival, and no one could waver. Stephen spent most of his time lying in the makeshift shelter. There were times when he would cry in pain, and we would take turns trying to comfort him. Without medicine or any kind of medical care, all we could do was improvise. Kolo used his creativity to create rudimentary splints to immobilize Stephen's broken leg. Using twigs and strips of fabric we ripped from our own clothes. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best we could offer. The following days were intense work. Hunting, fishing, fetching water, and caring for Stephen at the same time was a monumental effort. There were times when it felt like we were on the verge of collapse, but giving up was never an option. Each of us carried the responsibility of keeping the group together. More than ever, survival depended on our ability to collaborate. I remember one particularly hot afternoon. The sun was scorching hot, and our makeshift shelter was barely able to protect us from the sweltering heat. Food was becoming scarce again, and our daily routine was beginning to become a physical and mental struggle. We had to go fishing, but the tides were unpredictable, and the fish seemed to become increasingly scarce. In the midst of this chaos, Kolo, always resourceful, had an idea. He suggested we build a trap to catch fish more efficiently. Using fallen tree branches and vines, he began to build a type of enclosure in the shallow waters, which would direct the fish to a narrower area, making them easier to capture. We spent hours working on it, and at the end of the day, the result was promising. As time passed, the trap began to work, and we were able to catch more fish than we had in the previous weeks. It was a small victory, but for us it felt like a huge achievement. Stephen, even lying down and weak, did his best to support us emotionally. He knew he couldn't contribute physically, but he was always there with words of encouragement. Even though he was in pain, he made jokes reminding us not to lose our sense of humor in the midst of suffering. His words helped us keep going, reminding us that we were all in the same boat, or rather, on the same island. Time continued to pass, and the days merged into weeks. The island no longer seemed as threatening as before, but that didn't mean we were safe. The weather remained unpredictable, and there were days when storms caught us by surprise. One night the wind blew so hard that our shelter almost collapsed. We rushed to reinforce the structure, tying more leaves and branches together to protect it. We knew that if the shelter collapsed, we would be in serious trouble. Fire, which had become our most precious possession, also required constant care. We took turns making sure the flames never went out. Keeping it lit meant warmth, safety, and the ability to cook what little food we could. Once the fire almost went out in the middle of the night. An unexpected rain had soaked the wood, and we spent hours trying to relight it. When we finally did it, it was like we had won another battle. During these difficult days, our minds constantly returned to the question of rescue. Could it be that someone somewhere was still looking for us? Sometimes, on calmer nights, we would climb to the highest point of the island and remain silent, looking at the horizon in the hope of seeing some distant ship or light. The night vigil became a ritual, where we took turns watching the sea, looking for any sign of life. But the ocean seemed vast and desolate, as if we were the only living things in that part of the world. In these moments of silence, the longing for home hit more strongly. I wondered what my parents were thinking, if they still had hope of finding me alive. Would we ever return home? These thoughts haunted me, but at the same time they gave me the strength to continue. I knew that as long as we were alive, there was a chance that we would survive and be rescued. That hope was what kept us going. Little by little, Stephen began to show signs of improvement. His leg was still far from healed, but the swelling had gone down, and he was now able to sit without feeling so much pain. His recovery was slow but steady, and that filled us with hope. Seeing Stephen striving to improve, even in such adverse conditions, was a reminder that our struggle was not in vain. He refused to give up, and that inspired us to do the same. It was around this time that something unexpected happened. As we climbed up to the cliffs to hold our daily vigil, we saw something on the horizon. At first glance, it looked like just a distant cloud, but there was something different. The shine was not natural. It looked like smoke. Smoke coming out of a boat. My heart raced. I ran to warn the others, and in a matter of minutes we were all on the beach looking at the sea with wide, expectant eyes. It was not an illusion. There was something there. On the horizon. A boat. Our chance for rescue had finally arrived. We lit our fire quickly, throwing in dry leaves and twigs to create a column of smoke that rose toward the sky. We screamed, waved frantically, hoping someone on the boat would see us. But time passed, and the boat seemed to be slowly moving away. Panic began to set in within me. Did they not see us? Were they leaving? Then something happened. The boat stopped. We stood still, our hearts beating fast. They had seen us. The boat started to change direction, heading towards us. At that moment, emotion took over all of us. We cried, we laughed, we hugged. The feeling of relief was overwhelming. After 15 months of struggle, of pain, of survival, our chance to return home had finally arrived. When the boat finally anchored near the island, we saw the surprised faces of the crew. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. 6 young people, thin, dirty, and with long hair, living on a desert island. We climbed aboard one by one, and the feeling of being in a safe place, far from the dangers of the island, was indescribable. Stephen, still recovering from his broken leg, was carried carefully to the boat. As he stepped onto the deck, he looked at us and smiled. We knew we had survived the impossible. We had faced the island, the ocean, and our own limitations, and now we were heading home. But the adventure was not over yet. In the distance, the island of Atta disappeared on the horizon, but its marks on us would remain forever. When we finally got on board the boat, an avalanche of emotions took over us. The feeling of stepping on something solid, safe, that didn't sway to the uncontrollable rhythm of the waves was both strange and wonderful. The warmth of those sailors, the sound of their voices, and the shocked expressions on their faces made us realize how transformed we were. We were no longer the same kids who, 15 months ago, had left Raeva in search of adventure. We were dirty, thin, and our eyes reflected the long struggle for survival. The captain, a robust man with gray hair, watched us with an expression that mixed surprise and disbelief. His eyes lingered on each of us as if he was trying to absorb what we were doing there, in the middle of an island that, for him, should be deserted. He approached and in a deep and careful voice asked, "Who are you?" It was Stephen who broke the silence. His voice weak but still firm, he replied, "We are from Raeva. We were adrift for months, shipwrecked, and ended up stranded on this island." The captain remained silent for a moment as if trying to process what he had just heard. His expression softened, and then he turned to his crew, giving quick orders for them to provide us with food and water. We were taken to the covered part of the boat, where we were offered clean clothes and, most importantly, real food. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen such a hearty meal. There was plenty of bread, meat, fresh fruit, and water. But even with all this generosity, none of us managed to eat much. Our stomachs, unaccustomed to so much food, forced us to be cautious. Each bite was savored slowly, as if we still feared it could be taken from us at any moment. While we were eating, the sailors started asking us questions. They wanted to know what had happened, how we had survived for so long, and why we were on that island. Kolo, always the most talkative, took the lead and told the story from the beginning. The impulsive plan to travel to Fiji, the stolen boat, the storm that took us away, and the long months of fighting to survive. The sailors listened in silence, their expressions changing from disbelief to wary admiration. I could see in some of their eyes that even though they believed our story, they were still shocked by what they were hearing. After the meal, Captain Peter Warner approached me. He was an experienced man with years at sea and seemed genuinely concerned about our situation. "You're lucky boys," he said, crossing his arms. "That island wasn't on any of our routes. If it weren't for a navigational error and the reflection of that smoke you made, we never would have found you." This revelation left me speechless. The thought that our rescue was pure luck, a series of coincidences, made me feel a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. We could have been forgotten forever, and it made me realize how fragile our lives really were. As the boat continued its course, the captain tried to contact authorities in Raeva. To our surprise, when he finally got in touch, the news he received was even more shocking. Our families had already given up hope. Officially, we were considered dead. News of our disappearance had circulated throughout the neighboring islands, and at some point, the search was suspended. This information weighed on us like a rock. It was difficult to imagine that our families, our friends, had accepted that we would not return. An uncomfortable silence took over the group. Even with the relief of the rescue, there was still a long emotional road ahead. When we finally got home, there would be so much to explain, so much to fix. The trip back to Raeva was quicker than I expected. The boat, equipped with modern navigation systems and powerful engines, cut through the waves with ease. The feeling of speed and that we were finally heading in the right direction was both exhilarating and terrifying. We were returning to a world that had moved on without us. When the boat finally docked in the small port of Raeva, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and red. In the distance, we could see some people gathered on the shore, curious about what that boat was bringing. At first, no one recognized us. We looked so different with our long hair, makeshift clothes, and thin bodies that we looked strange. But then, something changed. A voice in the crowd shouted, and in an instant, all eyes turned to us. Recognition was immediate. There was a moment of absolute silence, and then screams of surprise and shock echoed through the harbor. Families started running towards us, and in the chaos, I saw my parents. They were there, standing still, with expressions that varied between disbelief and relief. When I finally reached them, my mother wrapped me in a tight hug, and there, in that moment, I allowed myself to cry. Not from sadness, but from pure relief. We were at home, but the story would not end there. Upon our return, we were soon embroiled in a series of legal issues. There was the fact that we stole a boat to begin our journey. The fisherman, owner of the vessel, demanded explanations, and it was not difficult to understand why. For him, we had committed a crime, and even after everything we had been through, we needed to deal with the consequences of our actions. I wondered how it could have escalated so quickly from a survival story to a legal issue. It was then that Captain Warner arrived on the scene again. He, realizing the magnitude of our story and the attention it generated, made an unexpected offer. He had contacts with major film and television producers and suggested that our story could be turned into a documentary. In return, he would promise to pay for the stolen boat and ensure that we didn't have any problems with the law. The idea of selling our story to the media seemed strange to me, but the prospect of not facing legal problems made us accept the offer. Soon a film crew arrived on the island. They wanted to document everything: our arrival, our expressions of relief, and most importantly, our story of survival. For days we followed the production team, revisiting the island where we were trapped, reenacting moments of our fight for survival, and trying to relive what, for us, was still very recent. It was surreal. Ada Island, which had been our prison for 15 months, now became the setting for a documentary. The documentary was a success. People from all over the world were fascinated by our story. For many, we were the true Lord of the Flies, boys who survived against all odds. But for us, there was no glamour in it. Only we knew what it was like to have faced that nightmare. Returning to normal life was not easy. Our bodies were marked by the scars of struggle, and our hearts carried the weight of experience. The people around us wanted to treat us like heroes, but all we wanted was to find a way to return to normalcy. That, however, seemed increasingly distant. When the documentary about our survival premiered, it quickly spread across the world. Our story of 6 boys shipwrecked on a desert island for 15 months sparked curiosity, empathy, and fascination. The public wanted to know how we had survived, what the most intense challenges were, and more than that, how we were able to overcome it all together. In a way, to those watching from the outside, it seemed like an epic, almost heroic story. But for us, who had lived through every second of that raw and unforgiving reality, emotions were much more complicated. At first, the attention we received seemed positive. We were treated like local celebrities, and people wanted to listen to us, talk about our experience, and understand more deeply what we had faced. The island's children followed us everywhere, enchanted by our story, while the adults looked at us with a mixture of admiration and pity. The documentary that had been recorded in Ada brought unexpected fame to our small community. Even people from other islands started visiting us, wanting to see the surviving boys up close. But we soon realized that fame had a price. What people didn't understand, and perhaps never fully understood, was the trauma we carried. Each of us had faced loneliness, fear, and the constant pressure of fighting for our own lives. We were back in civilization with food, water, and warm beds, but the feeling of always being on the verge of collapse remained. It was as if, in our minds, we were still trapped on that island. At night, the dreams came, the storm that swept us away, the hunger, Stephen's face lying on the cliffs. The island haunted us even from afar. Furthermore, continued attention exposed us to difficult questions. Why did we steal the boat? How do we survive without losing our minds? Was there a point when we thought about giving up? These questions, often asked by reporters or curious people, reopened wounds that had not yet healed. Kolo, who had always been the most talkative of the group, began to isolate himself. No matter how many times we told our story, no one seemed to truly understand what we had been through. Stephen, who was still recovering from his broken leg, was especially sensitive to this new reality. The weight of the accident still haunted him, and he struggled with the guilt of putting the group in danger by trying to hunt alone. I saw the sadness in his eyes, and no matter how much we tried to comfort him, he moved further and further away. What was once an unbreakable unity between us began to fragment as each of us dealt with the trauma differently. At a certain point, commercial offers began to appear. People wanted to buy the rights to our story to make it into a Hollywood movie. Producers and screenwriters surrounded us, promising large sums of money and international fame. Some of us, especially the younger ones, were tempted. The idea of having a film about our lives seemed fascinating, and the money could help our families, who were humble and lived from fishing and agriculture. However, for others like me, the idea of seeing our experience turned into a spectacle was unsettling. Our story was not a fantasy adventure. It was pain, struggle, suffering, and an emotional charge that no one really seemed to grasp. Arguments about what we should do began to divide the group. Kolo was inclined to accept the offers, as was Mano, the eldest, who saw the money as a chance to guarantee a better future for his family. Stephen, on the other hand, didn't even want to hear about it. For him, the idea of reliving everything in a film was unbearable. I found myself in the middle, trying to balance opinions and maintain the harmony we had achieved on the island. But for the first time since our rescue, I began to fear that our friendship, forged in the fires of survival, was beginning to disintegrate. The pressure increased even more when an international television network made a $1 million offer to adapt our story. This caused a definite division between us. Mano, ever the practical leader, argued that accepting this offer could guarantee the stability of our families forever. He talked about the sacrifice we had made and how we deserved something in return. But Stephen, his eyes heavy with sadness, said something that resonated with us all. How much is our pain worth? It was the first time we really stopped to think. For months, our survival had been just a matter of action, one day at a time, trying to secure food, water, and shelter. We had never reflected deeply on the emotional impact of it all. Yes, we had survived, but at what cost? And were we ready to turn this pain into entertainment for the world? The answer was not simple. Money would be a blessing to our families, and fame could open doors we never imagined. But Stephen's question kept nagging at my mind. How much was our pain really worth? Were we willing to relive the worst moments of our lives for the pleasure of others? Through it all, the local media continued to follow our every move. We were always in the newspapers, on the radio, and soon sensationalist reports began to appear. Some stories were exaggerated or distorted. Rumors began to spread that we had fought on the island, that we had lost our sanity at certain times. There was even speculation about whether we had actually survived alone or whether we had received help from some non-existent local tribe. These lies were painful, because after everything we had been through, we were now forced to defend our own truth. But the bigger question was yet to come. The impact of our time on the island began to manifest itself differently in each of us. Kolo, always energetic, began to have panic attacks. Any memory of the island made him feel trapped again. Mano, on the other hand, became increasingly obsessed with the idea of turning our story into something profitable. He believed we deserved to be rewarded for what we had endured. This, however, took him away from us. The relationship between all of us, which used to be one of absolute complicity, began to deteriorate. The emotional burden, constant media attention, and discussions about the future put pressure on us. We knew our experience had changed us forever, but now we faced a new battle, dealing with what was left of us, both as individuals and as a group. In the end, we all knew that nothing would bring back the 15 months we lost on that island, nor would it heal the deep wounds we carried. However, we needed to find a way forward, and that would take more courage than anything we faced during our survival. The island of Ada had left marks on us that would never disappear, but to the outside world, we were just a fascinating story. Survivors, heroes, or victims, depending on who told it. As media attention slowly began to wane, we were still dealing with the aftermath of the experience. The months following the rescue were a true test of our sanity. We had survived physical isolation, But now we faced the challenge of emotional isolation. We were surrounded by people, but the connection we had with each other seemed to crumble. The proposals to turn our story into a film or TV series kept coming. Mano, always determined to ensure that we took something positive from this tragedy, insisted that we should accept it. He argued that if our story had already been exposed to the world, we better have control over how it would be told. Kolo, after much initial resistance, began to give in to the idea, seeing an opportunity to change his life and that of his family forever. I, on the other hand, was torn. Part of me wanted to move on, leave everything behind and try to get back to a normal life. But the other part knew that was impossible. The island was imprinted on us in ways no one but the 6 of us could understand. Turning this experience into entertainment seemed almost profane. Still, I understood Mano and Kolo's reasons. The opportunity to secure a financial future for our families was tempting, especially considering the economic hardships we were all facing. Stephen continued to be the most resistant to the idea. For him, any attempt to profit from our pain was a betrayal of what we had faced together. In a conversation we had one night, he told me something I never forgot. We survived because of our unity. If we let this divide us, what was it worth? His words were engraved in my mind. I knew he was right. During the 15 months in Ata, our cohesion and friendship were what kept us alive. Every decision we made, every sacrifice made, was with the good of everyone in mind. Now here we were, about to be torn apart by issues of fame and money. It wasn't fair. It wasn't what we wanted for ourselves. While these discussions raged, our bodies were also still recovering from the physical wear and tear. Stephen, in particular, continued to deal with the aftermath of the fall that nearly killed him. His leg, although healed, would never be the same. He had a slight limp and was in constant pain, which left him frustrated and often reclusive. This physical change affected him deeply. He, who had been one of the most resilient in the group, now felt like a shadow of his former self. We others didn't come out unscathed either. Our bodies were weaker than ever, and our local doctors warned us that poor nutrition during our time on the island had permanently damaged our health. I felt the difference myself. My legs, once strong and agile, now trembled from the prolonged physical exertion. Walking long distances made me tired quickly, something that had never happened before the island. Despite everything, there were moments when I could feel a glimmer of hope. One afternoon, a few months after our rescue, I received an unexpected visitor. It was the fisherman, the owner of the boat we had stolen at the beginning of our journey. He had heard that we were involved in discussions about films and documentaries, and wanted to know what we would do about the debt we owed him. His gaze was stern, but there was also something else there, a mix of curiosity and maybe even a little understanding. I invited him to sit down, and together we recounted the beginning of our journey. I explained how, back then, we were just reckless kids, blinded by adventure and the desire to escape the monotony of island life. He listened silently, without interrupting. When I finished, he sighed and said, "You guys stole my boat, it's true. But from what I know now, you paid a price far greater than his worth." Those words took me by surprise. He forgave us for the youthful mischief that had triggered the entire sequence of events that almost cost us our lives. In the end, he said that he no longer wanted to hear about financial compensation, that the boat had already been restored with the help of Captain Peter Warner, and that what he wanted now was just peace. "Live your lives. Take advantage of this second chance that destiny gave you," were his last words before saying goodbye. That touched me deeply. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how much I was holding on to the feeling of debt, not just to him, but to life. I had blamed myself for going on this adventure and putting all my friends in danger. But perhaps, as the fisherman said, we had already paid the price, and now it was time for us to move on. However, moving forward was not as simple as it seemed. Stephen, even with the constant pain in his leg, resisted any attempt to integrate into the new life we were trying to build. He rejected interviews, avoided going out in public, and preferred to spend time at home, isolated. Little by little, the group that had been so united began to disperse. Mano, increasingly obsessed with the idea of telling our story to the world, constantly traveled to meetings with producers and lawyers. Kolo, who was initially reluctant, ended up accepting the idea and began to embrace the lifestyle of someone who had become a public figure. I, on the other hand, found myself in the middle of it all. Sometimes I helped Mano negotiate the rights to our history. Other times I isolated myself with Stephen, trying to understand his pain. I felt like we were all being pulled in different directions, and that scared me. Our survival in Atta had been built on our unity. And now, in the real world, that unity was unraveling before my eyes. I remember one night when emotional exhaustion had completely taken over me. I was sitting on the beach, looking at the ocean. The waves gently lapped on the sand and the moon illuminated the sea, creating an almost surreal scene of peace. But inside me, a storm still raged. What we had faced on the island had been terrible, but now we faced something that, in some ways, seemed even scarier. Life after the shipwreck. We weren't just kids anymore. We had moved, and so had the world around us. The future ahead of us was uncertain, and the only thing I knew for sure was that, despite everything, I couldn't let the island define me forever. We needed to find a way, together or apart. That ocean in front of me, which had once been our greatest enemy, now seemed to invite me to continue to move forward. Atta Island would always be part of who we were, but life had to go on. Time passed, and the months turned into a year since we returned from Atta. Life somehow had to move on, but we all realized that this was more difficult than we expected. The island had shaped who we were in an irreversible way, and now, as we tried to adapt to our new reality, it felt like the weight of our experiences was still pulling us back to that wild, inhospitable place. Mano became the visible leader of the group, assuming the role of negotiator and spokesperson for our history to the world. He became deeply involved with the producers, and little by little, our story began to take shape in scripts and adaptations. In the beginning, he was motivated by the need to ensure our families had financial security, a responsibility he shouldered almost single-handedly. But, over time, it seemed that Mano was increasingly distant from us, as if the desire to transform our suffering into a public narrative had consumed part of his essence. Kolo, in turn, followed a similar path, albeit in a lighter way. He indulged in the lifestyle of someone who, in one way or another, was thrust into fame. Although he avoided the spotlight more often than Mano, he began to find solace in talking about the experience, almost like public therapy. He seemed to be the only one who somehow found balance in telling our story over and over again, as if reliving the events eased his pain. But Stephen was a mystery, a soul that was never the same again. His leg, despite being healed, reminded him every day of the fall and his vulnerability. I visited him often, and our shared silence spoke more than any conversation. There was a disconnection in Stephen, something deep and dark that he never knew, or wanted, to fully express. On one of these visits, he told me, "I feel like part of me is still on that island, like I never left." These words left an impression on me. I also had moments when I felt the same. At night, when everything was silent, I could hear the sound of waves hitting the rocks of Atta. He could feel the biting wind and the smell of salt in the air. There was something eternal about those memories, something none of us could or wanted to completely let go of. Atta had shaped who we were now, and as painful as it was, that island was part of our identity. The island took a lot from us, but it also gave us something essential, an understanding of how fragile life is and what is really important. While Mano and Kolo continued their commitments and Stephen isolated himself, I tried to balance the demands of the world and the need for healing. It was during this time that I began to reflect deeply on what Atta really meant to us. I realized that even though we had survived, we were still struggling with the concept of overcoming. Surviving and overcoming are different things. On the island, we survived physical chaos, hunger, thirst, the elements. But here, in the real world, overcoming was an emotional battle. And often, it seemed even more difficult. The documentary, which had already been released months ago, continued to generate repercussions. People saw us as a kind of symbol of resilience and strength. But really, we were just trying to understand what it all meant. In a recent interview, Mano mentioned that if he had a chance to go back in time, he would have chosen not to steal the boat. This statement resonated with all of us, because deep down, we didn't want to go through that. Yes, we grow and become stronger. But at what cost? As the months passed, the distance between us became increasingly evident. Weekly meetings between the group began to become sporadic. Mano was always busy with new proposals, while Kolo ventured into international interviews. Stephen, as always, refused any invitation, preferring seclusion. I stayed in the middle, trying to maintain the connection that seemed to disintegrate little by little. There was one last attempt to bring everyone together. It was Mano who suggested the meeting. He thought we should go to Ra'aiva, our home island, to celebrate our friendship and remember what brought us together. The idea sounded good, perhaps a way to reconnect, to remember that above all we were friends who had faced the impossible together. On the appointed day, we returned to where it all began. The port of Ra'aiva, with its smell of the sea and the sound of seagulls, brought back an avalanche of memories. As we approached the beach, the sound of crashing waves reminded me of the first day in Ata, when everything seemed like one big adventure. Only now I knew how wrong we were back then. On the beach, sitting in a makeshift circle, we tried to recreate the sense of unity that saved us on the island. Mano started talking about what he had learned, about the importance of taking responsibility, about what the island taught him in terms of leadership and sacrifice. Kolo, in turn, made jokes about the crazy things we had faced, trying to ease the tension in the air. But what really touched me was Stephen, who, after months of silence, finally decided to speak out. "I've thought about this a lot," he began, his voice hoarse but firm. "And I realized that Ada, she gave us something that most people will never understand. The island forced us to be true, to face who we really are, without any mask. In that place, it was just us and our fears, and in a way it freed us." His eyes roved over each of us. "I'm not saying it was easy. Nothing was. But I realized that I can't stay stuck with that. I survived. We survived. And now, I want to live. Really live, not just survive the past." His words resonated with me. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Maybe Stephen was right. Perhaps Ada's true lesson was not just physical survival, but emotional survival. The understanding that, however much the past marks us, it does not need to define our future. That day we left the beach with a different feeling. We were no longer Ada's lost boys. We weren't just survivors. We were more than that. We had faced the darkness, both external and internal, and now we were ready to move forward. Each of us took a different path after that meeting. Mano continued with his projects, and Kolo found his own way of dealing with fame. Stephen, surprisingly, began to open up more, participating in community activities and even talking again about the possibility of telling his side of the story. As for me, I learned to accept that Ada would always be a part of me, but she was no longer what defined me. Life, like the ocean, can be unpredictable and unforgiving. It pushes us into situations we never imagined facing and sometimes tests us to the limit of our strength. But even in the midst of chaos and uncertainty, there is one fundamental truth. We are stronger than we think. Our ability to fight, to unite, and to adapt is what keeps us alive, even when everything seems to be against us. Ada's story is not just about physical survival. It's about overcoming fear, discovering who we really are, and understanding that even in the most difficult situations there is always a chance to start over. Life is full of ups and downs, but what matters is how we choose to continue. Remember, no matter how dark the waters may seem, there is always a light on the horizon waiting for you.
If this story captured and moved you, don't forget to like the video, share with those who love intense stories like this, and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing more narratives that will surprise you and stir your emotions. Don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey.